Ukraine has been. Putin's Kursk gamble just backfired big time. For months, Ukraine has been locked in a brutal fight over Kursk, a region where it managed to capture 450 square miles in August 2024. Russia has since clawed back 40% of that territory in a counteroffensive, bolstered by 50,000 troops, including up to 12,000 North Koreans sent by Kim Jong-un. Putin wanted these foreign reinforcements to tip the scales, but instead, they're becoming part of the problem. Ukraine isn't playing defense anymore. President Volodymyr Zelensky has unleashed a bold new counteroffensive, turning the tables on Putin's forces. With surprise attacks across multiple fronts, Ukrainian troops aren't just holding the line, they're pushing to take back what's been lost. So what does this mean for Kursk, for Putin, and for the North Koreans sent into the grinder? We'll break it all down, starting with the news. On January 6th, CNN reported that Ukraine had spent the previous day launching a volley of counteroffensive assaults against Russian positions in Kursk. The news was confirmed by Andriy Kovalenko, the head of Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, who told the outlet that Ukraine was launching surprise attacks throughout the border oblast. Much as it did with the initial Kursk invasion in August 2024, Ukraine was hoping that this surprise element would catch the Russians so off guard that they would be forced to cede territory. The strategy might be working. Posting to Telegram on January 5th, the head of the Ukrainian presidential office, Andriy Yermak, delivered a simple message. Kursk region, good news. Russia is getting what it deserves. Yermak provided no further details, though his message suggests that Ukraine had enjoyed at least some victories in its latest counteroffensive and that it would now start to push its advantage. Russia's defense ministry had the opposite message. While Yermak lauded the brave Ukrainian soldiers taking part in the counteroffensive and their supposed success, Russia claimed it had repelled the Ukrainian attackers. A defense ministry statement claimed Russia had taken decisive action, supported by artillery and aviation units. That action supposedly resulted in the destruction of the main Ukrainian forces that are gathered in the village of Berdyan, just 9 miles from the Ukrainian border, to prepare for the counteroffensive. Russia had prevented the Ukrainian armed forces from breaking through, claimed the ministry, suggesting that Yermak's Telegram post was false. Who's telling the truth? It's difficult to say at this point. CNN noted that it couldn't verify any of the battlefield reports relating to Ukraine's new counteroffensive at the time. However, we may get better insight from some of the Russian blogs posting about the attacks. CNN said that several of those blogs acknowledged the fighting that took place on January 5th and claimed that Ukraine's forces were pushing north to enter Berdyan. One blog claimed that Ukraine had thrown reserves into the new Kursk counteroffensive. It also noted that Ukraine had taken a clever approach to its counterattack. For the breakthrough, the AFU, or Armed Forces of Ukraine, covered the area with powerful radio-electronic warfare systems, hampering the work of Russia's unmanned aerial vehicles, claimed the blog. While pointing out that Russia's tanks and artillery are actively working against the enemy, the blog also said that most of the battles taking place involved small arms. Another Russian blog said that the fighting had started from the direction of Sudza, and that Ukraine had landed paratroopers into the region to support its fighters. In this offensive, the enemy uses mine clearance trawls, tanks, and other armored vehicles, claimed the blogger. So the one thing we can say for certain is that the counteroffensive is underway. And the use of the word breakthrough by the first Russian blogger suggests that Ukraine has enjoyed a lot more success than Russia's defense ministry would like to have the world believe. More information about the counteroffensive comes from other sources. The Guardian's report on Ukraine's attacks included footage of armored columns making their way across snow-covered fields en route toward a village named Bolsho-Soldatsko, situated just northeast of Sudza. This village appears to be a secondary target for Ukraine, suggesting that it has launched its counteroffensive on multiple fronts. That suggestion was essentially confirmed by Ukraine's general staff, which claims that 42 combat.
I can't get hard, not even with the blue pills. Will the salt trick work for me? All right, pay attention. If you're over 35 and not as firm as you should be, or if you're popping the champagne a little too early, I highly recommend the salt trick. In just 20 seconds,
clashes took place on January 5th, with 12 of those clashes continuing into the next day. The Guardian also says that there are unconfirmed reports that Ukraine's soldiers have entered Berdyan, along with making their way into another small town named Novosotnitsky. The Guardian also confirmed that Ukraine had used electronic countermeasures to take out Russian drones and that it had active sappers in the Kursk region removing Russian mines. These are not the sorts of reports we'd expect to hear if the Russian Defense Ministry's claims that it repelled the Ukrainian counteroffensive were accurate. And Ukraine is twisting the knife. In the Kursk region, the Russians are deeply concerned, claimed Andriy Kovalenko on January 5th. They were attacked on multiple fronts, which came as a surprise to them. This is far from the single attack near Berdin that Russia has attempted to minimize the counteroffensive into. Ukraine is attacking in dozens of locations, with fighting ongoing in many of them and possible successful reclamation of territory in others. It also appears that Ukraine may be using British-made weapons in its counteroffensive. In its report on the Ukrainian counteroffensive, The Telegraph said that reports coming in from military bloggers suggested that the fighting was both fierce and, at times, somewhat confused. Amidst the armored columns Ukraine was sending into its assaults were British Challenger 2 tanks, claimed the bloggers. The Telegraph couldn't confirm those reports, but if they're accurate, Russia has a major piece of equipment to deal with. The Challenger 2 is a stalwart of the British Army, having seen use in engagements as varied as Kosovo, Iraq, and Bosnia. The first batch was built in 1986, with the 4-person crude tank being among the more modern that have taken to the field in the Ukraine war. It comes with a main L-30A1 120mm rifled gun that can carry 47 rounds, along with a 7.62mm L94A1 chain gun that can rattle off fire at a terrifying rate. It's also a surprisingly speedy behemoth, with the tank being capable of traveling at up to 36.6 miles per hour, despite weighing 62.5 tons, more when it's loaded with its crew. If Ukraine is deploying these assets in Kursk, that tells us that it's serious about retaking at least some of the territory that it lost to Russia's own counteroffensive. The obvious question is simple: why is Ukraine engaging in this counteroffensive now? A small part of the answer relates to the conditions in Kursk at the time Ukraine launched its counteroffensive. Freezing winter weather in the oblast has made it difficult for Russia's ground forces to advance, while providing conditions that make it easier for Ukraine's armored units to move forward, according to The Guardian. Beyond the Challenger 2s, The Telegraph suggests there are also reports that Ukraine is using Bradley fighting vehicles in its advance, with those vehicles being used to ship the country's troops to positions quickly. Contrast that to Russia, which has been sending its infantry and North Korean troops to attack Ukraine's positions on foot, and you see a clear agility advantage for Ukraine. It's launching a counteroffensive now because it knows that a huge portion of Russia's troops are mired down in snow and ice, making them less able to respond. Speaking of Russia's North Korean troops and the Ukrainian advantage, there's another factor that plays into Ukraine's decision to counterattack now: Russia's casualty rates in Kursk. Our mention of Russia sending its soldiers to assault Ukraine on foot hints at the tactic Putin has relied upon so far during his Kursk counteroffensive, and it's the same tactic he's using inside Ukraine, sending wave after wave of cannon fodder at Ukrainian fortifications in the hope of exhausting the enemy's resources. These assaults have borne the fruit that everybody expects. Ukraine claims that in the 5 months between its initial Kursk invasion and the current counteroffensive, it's inflicted 38,000 casualties on Russia's forces. About 15,000 Russian troops have been killed in battle, with another 23,000 being injured. As if playing a childish game of tit-for-tat, Russia once again put out numbers to top the ones Ukraine released, claiming to have caused 49,010 troop casualties in Kursk during the same period. No details are provided about dead versus wounded, and it seems like an unusually high number, given how often Russia tries to minimize the numbers when it comes to how many Ukrainians are actually in Kursk. Russia is also losing a lot of the soldiers it's received from North Korean President Kim Jong-un as part of its collective defense treaty with its Asian ally. We mentioned earlier that Kim sent up to 12,000 of his soldiers, many reputed to be part of North Korea's elite Storm Corps, to Russia in October 2024. Zelensky reaffirmed that number during a January 2025 appearance on Lex Friedman's podcast, while adding that Ukraine has killed or wounded 3,800 North Korean soldiers. That's about a third of the entire contingent Kim has sent over, telling us that Ukraine has experienced plenty of success against Putin's biggest ally. In fact, the 2 days leading up to January 4th saw Ukraine destroy an entire battalion, comprised primarily of North Korean troops, according to Zelensky, suggesting that Kim's troops are experiencing casualties thick and fast. Why does this matter in the context of Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive? Well, it all comes down to numbers. Ukraine has been chopping away at the 50,000-strong force Putin sent into Kursk to reclaim the territory. That brave defense has resulted in a weakened Russia. With fewer troops with which to launch attacks, Russian pressure may be waning, which has opened the door for Ukraine to launch counterattacks. There are now gaps in the Russian front line, or at least in areas where there are more scattered troops compared to those with rigid defenses. Ukraine has likely identified where Russia is weakest based on its casualty rate and used that information to hit Putin where it hurts. Where Russia's leader would have hoped that this human wave approach would break down Ukraine's defenses, he instead weakened his own to give his enemy more opportunities. Ukraine has taken those opportunities, and it now appears to be advancing into several of the small villages and towns that it lost to Russia's initial Kursk push. But there's more. Ukraine is also mindful of a massive event that's set to occur midway through January, the ascension of President-elect Donald Trump to the White House. Trump was another subject of Zelensky's conversation with Friedman. Ukraine's leader highlighted that Trump's security guarantees could lead to the end of the war in Ukraine, but only if Trump followed through on his promises. Zelensky also hinted at the fact that Trump appears to have enough leverage over Putin to at least force a ceasefire to the Russian leader's special military operation. For his part, Trump has claimed that he'll end the war within days of coming into office, with his much vaunted but ill-defined peace plan likely being the biggest card America's incoming president has to play. Zelensky knows this. He told Friedman that Trump and I will come to an agreement and offer strong security guarantees together with Europe, and then we can talk to the Russians. Whether Ukraine's leader actually believes this is up for debate. After all, he told French President Emmanuel Macron on December 30th that Ukraine needs to be realistic about its territorial issues and that there will be no quick and easy resolution to the war. Territorial issues is the key phrase relating to Ukraine's most recent counteroffensive. Theories abound about what Trump's plan will actually look like, but one of the most popular involves creating a massive demilitarized zone across the 745-mile front line of the Ukraine war. That zone will be patrolled by European troops. Polish, German, British, and French soldiers have all been suggested, with the US taking a hands-off approach. Both Ukraine and Russia would have to agree to the conditions of a ceasefire, with the zone preventing either from attacking the other. From there, peace plans could begin, with negotiations likely to revolve around the territory each country has. Russia currently holds about a fifth of Ukraine, with the majority of that territory being in the south and east. Putin's push in Donetsk, more on that later, could lead to Russia holding even more by the time that Trump comes to power. As for Ukraine, it has Kursk as leverage that it can use to reclaim some of the territory Russia has overrun during Putin's special military operation. So another reason for Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive becomes clear. For as many soldiers as Putin has lost in his effort to retake Kursk, he's at least seeing some success. We mentioned earlier that Russia has already retaken about 40% of what it had lost to Ukraine's August 2024 invasion. Ukraine's counteroffensive is an attempt to retake at least a portion of that lost territory, so that it has as much leverage as possible if and when Trump brings it to the table with Russia. And Kursk holds a lot of value for Putin. Though smaller in the context of how much territory Russia has snatched from Ukraine, Kursk still represents the first time that Russia has been invaded successfully.
You are using apple cider vinegar the wrong way. If your goal is to lose belly fat, you need to use it the right way. Guys, I discovered a way to turn apple cider vinegar into something even more powerful than those Manjaro pens. Seriously, when you take it the right way, it shrinks your belly, reduces
successfully since World War II. Leaving it in Ukrainian hands, even if that means trading Kursk for much more territory inside Ukraine, will be a black eye for Putin. He may be willing to trade more of Ukraine than he gets in return for Kursk to soothe his humiliation. Zelensky will be banking on that, which is one of the reasons we're now seeing Ukraine push to reclaim territory in Kursk. He's creating pressure for Putin. And that brings us to another reason why Ukraine has chosen now to counterattack in Kursk. Fellow of the American think tank Yorktown Institute Robert Clark affirms that Ukraine intends to use any territory it has in Kursk as a bargaining chip later on. However, he also notes that Putin has committed a lot of his reputation amongst his own people to the success or failure of Russia's current efforts in Kursk. Clark says Ukraine's latest move will mean a huge deal more to Putin than it will to Trump in the context of peace talks. Putin has told the Russian people over the Christmas period that he will return all of Kursk to Russia. So the ability for Putin to really retain control of Kursk is going to be far more important to him and to Russia than it will be to President Trump going forward. Again, it's the humiliation aspect we mentioned earlier. Putin is under pressure from his people and perhaps forces in the Kremlin that have taken Kursk as a sign of weakness, thanks to what Ukraine is doing. Reclamation of the Russian land lost becomes a whole lot harder when Ukraine is actively taking territory back, along with defending what it still holds. Times Radio's international correspondent Alex Cadier agrees. He says that Ukraine's counteroffensive bucks the narrative of the last few months, in which Russia has been slowly retaking territory in Kursk. And again, that creates pressure for Putin. It shows him that even with the massive manpower advantage that comes courtesy of having North Korean troops, Ukraine's forces still have the capacity to punch back. And these heavy punches will stack even more pressure onto Putin, Cadier claims. It's certainly significant in the amount of resources that have been put into it, Cadier says when referring to Ukraine's counteroffensive. But also, it will have very serious diplomatic consequences if and when these ceasefire talks happen. So it all seems to have worked out well for Ukraine. Wintry conditions gave it the mobility advantage it needed to launch the counteroffensive in the first place. Having enjoyed so much success in terms of pure Russian and North Korean casualty rates only added to the opportunity that winter delivered, as it created gaps for Ukraine to exploit. And with Donald Trump soon to become president, Ukraine is taking every chance it gets to grab territory and pile pressure onto an already weakened Putin, both domestically and in terms of upcoming peace talks. There's also the matter of Donetsk to consider. While all of this fighting in Kursk is going on, Russia is pushing hard to claim as much territory in Ukraine's east as possible. Russia is advancing through that region at the fastest rate it's managed in terms of territorial acquisitions since February 2022 and the initial invasion. Putin's troops are on the verge of flanking the Donetsk city of Pokrovsk and have forced the abandonment of key Ukrainian defensive positions. These include an underground stronghold in a ruined thermal power plant that Ukraine has spent most of the war defending. These advances won't have escaped Zelensky's notice. In fact, some commentators have even criticized Ukraine's actions in Kursk, with that criticism likely to intensify in the wake of the counteroffensive. Critics suggest that Ukraine will be better served committing the troops it has stationed in Kursk to the Donetsk defense, thus slowing the Russian advance. The Ukraine military's commander-in-chief Alexander Syrsky says otherwise, claiming that the entire Kursk operation has forced Russia to divert troops it would have sent to Donetsk. By launching its counteroffensive in Kursk, Ukraine hopes to keep these troops committed and perhaps push Moscow into diverting more, so it can stem the flow of losses in Donetsk while it retakes chunks of Kursk. The question now is simple: will Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive succeed? It's a little too early to tell, as the operation is still ongoing. However, Ukraine does have a history of failed counteroffensives during Putin's special military operation. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine attempted a counteroffensive in southern and eastern Ukraine to take back land snatched up during the initial invasion. That counteroffensive stalled out, meaning Ukraine failed in its attempt to sever the connection between Russia-controlled Crimea and the Ukrainian mainland. Could this counteroffensive in Kursk suffer the same fate? It's possible, though the conditions are far different. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine spent several months building up the forces and weaponry it needed to launch its counteroffensive. That gave Russia plenty of time to prepare, allowing Putin's forces to create layered defenses across the front line. Trenches and mines were laid in strategic areas, all of which slowed the Ukrainian attack to a crawl, allowing Russia to mostly defend its captured territory. That's not what's happening during Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive. Ukraine launched surprise assaults this time around. It's still targeting multiple points along the front line, just as it did in summer 2023, but it's doing so without giving the Russian forces a chance to prepare. Ukraine is also attacking while Russia is in mid-attack itself, again eliminating the defensive mindset that allowed Putin's forces to successfully repel the summer 2023 counteroffensive. There's also the possibility that the current Kursk counteroffensive might be diversionary. The BBC reports that a handful of Russian military bloggers have speculated as much, with Yuri Podloyarka suggesting Ukraine's current attacks may be diverting Russia away from a larger attack to come. Alexander Kots, another Russian blogger, seems to agree, claiming that a main attack may be launched elsewhere while Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine's smaller attacks. Perhaps Ukraine has something bigger lined up for Russia. If that's the case, it casts Russia's claims of having quelled at least portions of the Ukrainian counteroffensive into a new light. Perhaps Russia was meant to have deflected those smaller attacks. Ukraine may be poking the bear, inflicting casualties along the way as it prepares for a heavier push against a weakening Russia in Kursk. That all remains to be seen. For now, we want your opinions on the Ukrainian Kursk counteroffensive. Is this Ukraine's last gasp attempt to hold on to land before Trump becomes president? Is a larger Ukrainian attack coming? Is Putin trapped? The war in Ukraine has now lasted for over 1,000 days. That's 1,000 days of both Russia and Ukraine continuing to accumulate losses, both countries trying to use every available tool at their disposal to turn the tide of the war. For Ukraine, this meant receiving more than $230 billion in aid, either financial or military, from NATO and its allies across the globe, and the Ukrainian military has used this aid to great effect, even managing to counter-invade Russia, the implications of which we'll discuss shortly. For Russia, though, the war has been nothing short of a disaster from day one. It started with a failed operation to sever the Ukrainian government at its core in Kyiv. That led to the lackluster mobilization and logistics strategies that ultimately caused the initial invasion of Kyiv to be repelled by the Ukrainian forces. Then the Russian Navy was forced to abandon its posts alongside the Ukrainian coast, a remarkable achievement for Ukraine considering that they have no real navy to speak of, which leads us to the first half of 2024, which saw negligible gains for the Russian military on the current main front line in Donbass. But what exactly led to this sudden decline? And is this an indicator that the war might be coming to an end, with Putin finally admitting defeat? The truth of Russia's current situation is nuanced and depends on multiple factors, so let's delve a bit deeper into what exactly led to Russia's military failure in Ukraine and the possible ramifications of the war extending into 2025. It wouldn't be wrong to say the first half of 2024 was considered the preparation phase for both countries. The Russian military enacted some of its plans in late spring and early summer in the aptly named Summer Campaign of 2024. The campaign involved mounting a renewed invasion effort on the Kharkiv region, which was previously freed from Russian occupation back in November 2022. By now it should be obvious how the summer invasion turned out for the Russians. It was a colossal failure. The Russian military used odd tactics in the region, to say the least. Instead of leveraging the army's large consignment of military vehicles, specifically tanks, the Russians predominantly focused on infantry-based strategies. Reports from the Kharkiv region at the time suggested that the Russian army used regular soldiers who would ride motorcycles to get to the newly made front lines as quickly as possible before discarding their bikes to join their fellow soldiers in the trenches. To support this initiative, Russia deployed makeshift turtle tanks, actually T-62s, T-72s, and T-80s, modified with additional metal armor on top. Those modifications highlighted Russia's growing desperation on the Kharkiv front, as even its older tanks required makeshift upgrades to remain viable in combat. The turtle tanks had practically no offensive capabilities, which indicated that Russia was starting to run out of usable tanks and modern armor to use on the Kharkiv front. Why is that? Well, the answer perhaps lies in how Russian tanks proved to be much more vulnerable than they were supposed to be. On paper, T-90s should be modern tanks with combat capabilities close to the American M1 Abrams, the British Challenger 2, or the German Leopard 2. All of these tanks have similar main armaments, electronic warfare defenses, and optics for low vision and nighttime operations. In fact, the T-90 was lauded to have some of the most potent armor casing of modern tanks. However, the T-90, like its older cousins, the T-70s and 80s, was equipped with an autoloader for the main armament, unlike its Western counterparts. This feature allowed the tank to operate with one fewer crew member, but came with a critical design flaw. The spare ammunition was stored both below the main turret in the autoloader and dispersed throughout the hull, a layout that was necessary due to the smaller size of Russian tanks. This configuration created a devastating vulnerability. If explosive ordnance penetrates the tank and ignites the stored ammunition, whether in the autoloader or elsewhere in the hull, it can trigger a chain reaction of detonating shells. This jack-in-the-box effect results in the catastrophic destruction of the tank, often launching the turret sky high. In traditional vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infantry combat, this wasn't particularly noteworthy, as the casing was a relatively small target that could only be hit slightly above or below the vehicle, which were unusual trajectories for ground combat. However, the Ukrainian army used weapons and tactics that capitalized on that weakness by using small, commercial-grade drones and outfitting them with grenades or anti-tank mines. The Ukrainian drone operators could directly guide the drone above the tank, specifically targeting either the hatch or the ammo storage. The result, the absolute annihilation of Russian tanks, in which practically no measures were enough to protect against the incoming drones. The proliferation of drone-based warfare stretched far beyond using them against tanks. The drones were outfitted with either surveillance capabilities or explosive ordnance, making them vital to practically any scenario and used on both sides of the conflict. The main benefit of using drones, at least for Ukraine, is that it allows its army to shore up its two major weaknesses. The first was lack of personnel. Ukraine has roughly a third of Russia's population, and its armed forces at the start of the war were outnumbered by as much as 5-to-1. This ratio got better over time as Ukraine tightened its conscription efforts and volunteers flocked to defend the country. But even today, Ukraine is estimated to have around 70% of Russia's total active manpower and only 60% of reserve forces. Secondly, drone warfare was a great economic equalizer. The FPV drones Ukraine used for small-scale missions cost as little as $400 to $500, making them highly affordable. Meanwhile, surveillance drones like the DJI Mavic cost between $1,500 and $3,000, according to Reuters. Even more robust models such as DJI's agricultural drones only cost a few $1,000s, keeping drone warfare relatively inexpensive compared to traditional military equipment. More robust drones such as the agricultural models from DJI come at a higher price point. For example, the DJI Agras T10 costs nearly $10,000, while other models in the Agras line range into the tens of thousands of dollars. Despite their higher cost, these drones offer significant capabilities, making them valuable assets on the battlefield. When combined with the ordnance and necessary modifications to make the drone flightworthy in a more militarized setup, such as extending its total range, Ukraine could field a single-use anti-tank drone for as little as $15,000. Compare this to the cost of the average tank, which ranges from $2 to $4 million.
EVE Online is a vast universe, alive with the unrelenting activity and combined history of its players. Pursuing lives of adventure, warfare, and prosperity, they share this existence in the biggest single shard, free-to-play MMO of all time. Set 21,000 years in the future, EVE takes place in a distant cluster of over 7,000 star systems known as New Eden.
And you can see why investing in drones can be lucrative. Even if 1 in 10 drones hits a target, which is often the most cited statistic from the Ukrainian military squads that focus on drone warfare, it could be well worth the investment. Drone warfare has also redefined Ukraine's coastal defenses. The initial wave of the Russian invasion included the Black Sea Fleet that blocked Ukraine's coast and prevented ships from venturing into deeper waters. This resulted in Ukraine's marine trade having to be rerouted either by hugging the coastal waters, moving alongside Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria, or by transporting the goods over ground to Romania and using its port to send ships through the Bosporus. Regardless of the option, the increased length and logistics caused grain prices to rise globally, as Ukraine is the 7th largest exporter of wheat in the world. The Ukrainians managed an early victory in April 2022 when they located the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, Moskva, and fired at it with coastal anti-ship missiles. But the real kicker came with drones, this time modified for sea-to-sea warfare. Ukraine has taken drone warfare to a new level, using coastal drones like the Sea Baby and Magura V5 to target Russian ships. These surface-based drones carried out nighttime raids that forced the Black Sea Fleet to retreat miles away from Ukrainian shores. Most of the fleet has since been relocated to Novorossiysk, leaving Sevastopol largely inoperable due to repeated long-range missile strikes. This has severely limited Russia's naval power in the region. The scale of Ukraine's drone warfare only grew in 2024, leading to significant Russian equipment losses that Moscow struggled to replenish. Reports from Russian state-owned agencies like TASS and IRA Novosti claim that Russia deployed its experimental T-14 Armata tanks, a modern upgrade to the T-90, on the battlefield. However, other sources, including the National Interest, dispute these claims, stating that the T-14s were never deployed due to their high cost and inefficiency compared to the T-90. Even if deployed, the T-14s would likely have faced the same challenges as other Russian equipment. Long-range Ukrainian drone tactics and frequent attacks made deploying expensive assets too risky. Ukraine's ability to produce and launch drones daily has created a consistent and cost-effective threat that Russia has struggled to counter. Russia's losses came to a head in August 2024 when Ukraine did what was previously unthinkable. They occupied Russian territory. The Ukrainian army crossed the border into the Kursk region, catching Russia by complete surprise. The Kursk invasion started small, with reports of between 300 and 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers supported by armored vehicles, tanks, and long-range strikes. But the extent of the invasion would soon grow to allow Ukraine to occupy roughly 500 square miles of territory inside Kursk in 3 weeks, which was more than Russia gained over the previous 7 months. The Kursk invasion highlighted a few problems that Russia seemed to struggle with, which would only accelerate its possible downfall. First, the Kremlin's response to the Kursk invasion was counterintuitive, paradoxical, and delayed. Initial reports from Russia suggested that it would mount a counteroffensive in as little as a few days, and yet the counteroffensive didn't come. Russian soldiers rapidly retreated from the region, with the military building defensive trenches to slow the Ukrainian advance. Those same trenches would be used by Ukraine itself when they managed to take over the territory, as they would stall the Russian counteroffensive in turn. The official reports from the Kremlin severely downplayed the actual state of the invasion, suggesting that the damage was significantly lower than first reported. This was obviously an attempt to keep the Russian population sternly under the influence of existing propaganda, which perpetuated the notion that Ukrainians were being used by the West to remove Russian culture. The propaganda went so far as to call the invaders terrorists, which was possibly a way for Putin to justify more persistent conscription efforts throughout the country. Secondly, the Ukrainian soldiers met relatively little resistance in Kursk. Unlike the contract soldiers who were fighting on the front, the bulk of the stationed troops in the Russian regions surrounding Ukraine seemed to be conscripted men on mandatory military service terms. Ukraine managed to capture around 600 men in the 3 weeks of the invasion, and an early report suggested that conscripts comprised 80% of the prisoners of war that were processed. The interviews with the prisoners revealed that some conscripts received as little as a few weeks of training before being shipped to their posts. The significant disparity between the use of conscripts and contract soldiers indicated that Russia was already trying to cut down its costs as much as possible. The Russian budget for 2024 was expected to expend as much as 40% of the government's spending on military and national defense. In other words, the country would use roughly 7% of its GDP on the military, a figure nearly double that of the US and triple most Western countries. The contracts for the soldiers were made much more lucrative, with salaries triple or quadruple the national average, ostensibly to attract as much manpower as it could for the front lines as possible. And yet, while the number of Russian contract soldiers soared through 2023 and 24, the actual number of troops hasn't. According to Riddle, an independent Russian media outlet that compiled the number of newly signed contracts throughout 2023, the figures reported by Russian authorities are significantly more inflated than reality suggests. Of the 490,000 contracts in 2023, Riddle estimates that only 150,000 to 200,000 of those indicate actual new troops that Russia could use. The disparity was chalked up to the significantly shorter contracts that the military